Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron. I'm editor-in-chief of RCR Wireless News. Thanks for joining us today. Today we are joined by Roger Entner, who is a longtime industry analyst. He's also founder and lead analyst at Recon Analytics. Roger, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And when I say long time, I don't mean by to age you at all, but I'm just saying Roger has been around long enough to see a lot of things. He started when he was 12 years old, so he's still in his prime. So anyway. So yeah, Roger, thanks again for taking the time. So I know you came out pretty recently with a report working with CTIA, the Industry Trade Association, kind of looking at the spectrum market and kind of where the U.S. is in terms of spectrum and availability of spectrum. And the interesting part is kind of in terms of how we rank perhaps with other countries, maybe in Europe, some more developed countries around the world. So hoping to get some more insight from you on that report. So maybe start off with, I guess, a general overview from you on kind of what the report was, kind of what kind of came out of the report.
So when we looked at the report, it was basically a look at the G7 countries, the 7 largest economies in the world. That makes it nicely as comparative as we can get it. And I looked at, what's the speed differential between the different countries? How does the United States basically stack up against the other countries? Is the U.S. wireless industry doing a good job? And what we're seeing is the U.S. has been the first country with LTE and high speed data, and we saw that very early on, having the fastest data. And the United States improving data speeds continuously, over the last 5 years. But what we also saw is that other countries have overtaken us. And a lot of it has to do with the availability of clean spectrum, ideally in large chunks. And that gives you faster and better outcomes.
Yeah, well, it does seem like you're right. I mean, obviously, when you look at some countries like perhaps South Korea, for instance, they seem to have a very central plan on how they're going to give spectrum out to carriers. So the carriers in South Korea, for instance, have huge chunks of spectrum, lots of clean spectrum. They're always touting these high speeds. That seems like one of those markets that maybe perhaps not part of this conversation here, but obviously one of those countries that seems to really kind of be maybe ahead of the game when it comes to getting spectrum out to carriers.
Well, it has been a lot very forward-looking in taking advantage of all the allocations that are actually technically feasible. In the U.S., we are also looking at competition. So there's always this trade-off between larger spectrum blocks that allow fewer carriers to actually provide the service, but in a fast fashion, or divide the spectrum up in smaller chunks and give more carriers the opportunity to engage. And it's a trade-off. You can't have your cake and eat it at the same time. So we've decided, or the FCC has decided, that it wants to have more carriers providing. At the same time, that means that our speeds inherently will not be as fast as that of other countries.
Yeah, and that seems to be kind of the whole situation. That's like kind of the catch-22 that your report kind of goes into, is the fact that you're right. I mean, it's the FCC, current FCC administration is very big on competition, and they want entrants. They're the spectrum auctions that are coming up. They've definitely cut up a lot of spectrum there for them. But like you said too, they're also the regulators and a lot of politicians are always chiming in about wanting to have higher speeds and things for carriers, but that requires certain blocks of spectrum, and so that seems to be kind of where we're stuck at, perhaps in the U.S. when it comes to how we compete against other countries.
Yes, and the answer is we need more spectrum, and ideally big chunks for everybody. And what comes to it is we're using smartphones more intensively than anybody else in the G7 countries, so the usage is higher as well. Nobody uses more video, for example, than the United States. So from that perspective, it's very taxing on the networks, and the more people, as it is a shared resource, more people who use it, the smaller the slice is. But the U.S. industry is throwing more money at it than anybody else.
Yeah, yeah, that was interesting about your research. I mean, you kind of dig into the fact that the U.S. does, per carrier, throw in a lot more money when it comes to building out these networks than all these other countries do. You also mentioned a bit in there kind of about the pricing models too. I mean, it seems like in some countries they're charging extra for LTE access as opposed to 3G access, where here in the U.S. that's kind of been thrown in, and it's carriers almost want to have customers rather on LTE than 3G just because of the spectral efficiency there. So it seems like it's a different model.
Exactly. You have in the U.S., it doesn't matter how expensive it is, what technology you use, you're paying the same amount, and it's your choice. In a country like the UK, you traditionally pay extra for the new technology. When EE came out with the same price, it was accused by Vodafone of devaluing 4G. In other countries, like Germany, it's tied to how much data you're buying. So the more data you're buying, the faster the speed that they're providing to you. All of the, especially that one is really interesting. And if we look at net neutrality, would be highly questionable how the purists look at that. France is a mixture of the two. It's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously you bring up that net neutrality issue, and that seems to be the timing of that. That's getting a lot of attention right now with the FCC and a lot of comments going in on net neutrality issues. But it's also coming at a time when the FCC is doing these new spectrum auctions too, and they're also kind of recommending to carriers how they might consolidate or not consolidate. So it's an interesting time this past couple of months or the months going forward too, because it is we're going through this net neutrality stuff, we're going through these spectrum auctions. There's concern about getting more spectrum out there at some point as well too, and it seems like all these things have kind of come together while at the same time, carriers are rolling out LTE even more and more, putting more spectrum behind it. Consumer demand is not diminishing at all. Like you said, video is just growing more and more. It's an interesting time we're kind of going through right now here, at least in the U.S.
And, yeah, we're right in the midst of it, and this report was really meant to bring facts to the discussion. And that we look at it, how is it really, how are we stacking up? And of course we want to be number one, but if we're not number one, how can we become number one? And I think the report lines out the steps that we can do, or we make the conscious decisions, we don't want to be number one. I don't know how well that goes down in certain parts of the country, but it's a conscious decision. But I think what's also really, really enlightening is among the G7 countries, American consumers are the most satisfied with the service and with the devices. And interestingly, Japan, it's dead last. So.
Don't tell Sprint that. That's not good for them right now.
Well, I think it's not only a one-way street, but the U.S. carriers, Sprint included, is doing a lot of things right. And yes, we're sitting here in a little fishbowl and looking outside, and everything seems to be better. But it's not. Americans are getting a tremendous value for what they're consuming, and we have integrated it more than anybody else. Even though cards are in a way stacked against us. I looked at urban agglomeration, basically how concentrated is the population, and yes, we're a big country and there are huge cities, but we're actually the least concentrated country. 80% in the U.S. live in urban areas, but only 7% of the urban population lives in New York, the biggest market. And in Japan, it's 90% lives in urban markets, and over 30% lives in Tokyo. So if you cover Tokyo, you're basically good. You know, that will take care of the, or even if you do Nagoya and Osaka, you know, you basically covered, you know, almost 3/4 of the population of the country. In the U.S., good luck, you know. You have these tiny markets that comparatively, as a proportion of the country, that you have to add up, and that really eats up a lot of money. But still, you know, look at the carriers. We have now 99 with LTE. We have 99% people coverage, and the biggest, you know, white spots in the country are, you know, the military areas where nobody can go to, like, you know, Mojave Desert, Area 51, and these things. That's like the biggest white spots left, and you'd get shot if you go there.
True, true, and that's a good point. I mean, for myself, I'm stationed here out west, and near Denver. So Denver itself is a big market, but obviously there's areas, I can drive 10 minutes from here and be in an area where nobody has coverage because it's just a hard area to get to. But I'm also surprised at times where I go to some areas where there is coverage, and you think you're in the middle of nowhere, and there is coverage. So you're right. I mean, that's definitely a huge challenge, it seems, for the U.S. carriers is, to get that 99% coverage, they've had to put towers and resources into some areas that, the return on investment there is probably not the best. So the fact that they've been able to do that, it does seem like it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, they want to provide ubiquitous coverage. And yes, the probably 70s, I remember, like, when was that, 10 years ago or so, talking with one of the carriers, and at that time they said, we can profitably cover 70 to 75% of the population. If we go above that, we do that out of our duty to provide full geographic, or at least people coverage, and we're going to lose money on it. And I don't think the economics have really changed since then.
Yeah, and I think I remember too. Also, looking back in history a little bit, it did seem like that. I know in some of the European countries that the government helped in a few cases to help provide coverage in kind of those last 2 or 3% of the population that needed to be covered, or areas that needed to be covered. The government helped out with some subsidies there and getting out. Obviously, in the U.S., there are some USF programs and things like that as well. But at least that's kind of an issue that's been used in Europe too. So
yeah, in France they have, like, in the middle of the country, the Massif Central. And the only way they could cover it is the carriers paid a third, the central government paid a third, and the local municipalities paid a third. And then only that way they got to 100% coverage. But France is like the size of California, with twice the number of people. So from that perspective, it's much easier to do this. But the U.S. overall is, I think, doing a good job. We could do a better job if we would have more spectrum. But, the industry is certainly putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, well, that's a good point too. I mean, obviously, the spectrum issue. I mean, there are auctions coming up. There's one coming up in November with the AWS-3 auction. And then there's the incentive auction planned for next year. I guess looking at that, I mean, how do you feel the government has done in at least trying to free up more spectrum? I mean, it does seem like it's becoming more and more difficult. But I guess what's your general view of how they've done, and obviously, can they do better?
Well, when we look at AWS 3, the key here is that we have created here a spectrum block that provides international roaming ability. That is really the key for the spectrum. It's overall, the amount of spectrum that's being auctioned is not going to solve the spectrum crunch in large urban areas. But the key is here, and I think the United States, almost behaved like that the world ends at our shores, with some consideration to Canada and Mexico. But the spectrum harmonization that exists basically everywhere else in the world, we're the odd man out. And the one who is being punished especially with LTE, because with LTE, there's so many bands and you can only put so many into a device that we will not have the advantage of the quad phones with 3G. And suddenly, you go overseas and your phone doesn't work to the standards you expected from home. And I don't know who you're going to curse, but it's definitely not the U.S. government that coming to the first coming up first, because it's the failed spectrum harmonization. When we look at the incentive auction, fundamentally great idea. My big concern is that the more and more conditions we're putting on, and the more and more bees are flocking to the circle, and have a share of that of the proceeds, and put conditions on regarding how we should allocate the spectrum and who can bid, the lower the amount is that the spectrum is actually worth. And if we put too many conditions on, it will fall below that the broadcasters would like to have, and then the whole thing fails. And then we need another act of Congress. I was very impressed and very pleased that they were able to get around to come to this. Do I expect them to do this again? Not necessarily, and definitely not anytime soon. Because they're rightfully going to say, look, we gave you this broad authority, and somebody bungled it up. Don't expect from us to make this your top priority. And the less restrictions you put on spectrum, the more it's worth. We saw it very clearly with the 700 megahertz auction. The least amount of money was raised for 700 C block that had net neutrality attached to it. The next lowest amount of money was the B block that had originally the interference from channel 51 from the TV stations. And the amount of money that was raised for the B block, which had no restrictions whatsoever to it, was actually the most. So the market is clearly valuing restrictions and inhibitions. And the less restrictions you want to put on, the more money you will get. Yeah. And this is especially critical for this auction, because if we don't raise enough money, it's going to fail. In every other auction, we could go back, the FCC could go back and say, oh, let me try again. There's no let me try again with this one. That's my big concern.
Yeah. No, I mean, this, again, the incentive auction, I would agree with you. It does seem like the FCC has done quite a bit to get it to this point, but I agree with you as well that there still seems to be hurdles in place that will make this auction, if it does to be successful, it's going to be a huge challenge. I mean, there are still so many things that need to kind of fall into place for this to work.
Yeah, I really, really hope so, because it's really good for the country to bring more spectrum here. But it's the most complicated construct that has ever been attempted to get spectrum in the hands of people who can use it the most productively.
Yeah. And I think recently, I think one of the FCC commissioners had mentioned too that even going forward beyond the incentive auction, any future auctions are probably going to have to rely on some sort of incentive type of situation, because again, most of that spectrum is in the hands of broadcasters or somebody else, and you're going to have to somehow they're going to see this auction and say, hey, I'm not going to give up my spectrum without getting something back. So it's just setting a precedent that could prove to be challenging going forward too.
Well, I have confidence in the FCC that they get it right.
Well, that's good. I'm good you have confidence there with those guys. Obviously, like you've said, it's going to be a huge challenge, and again, to kind of solve this spectrum issue, it needs to be successful, like you said, and so hopefully they pull it all through. So it'll be interesting to see. Well, again, hey Roger, we definitely appreciate on the topic. Like I mentioned, this report that's available on the Recon Analytics website. You definitely should go check it out. It's one of the more exhaustive ones that Roger's put together. Not that he hasn't put together some big ones, but this is a good report. Really, lots of information on it. And also, we're done with CTIA too, so I think you can go to the CTIA website and check it out as well. But Roger, we definitely appreciate the time and insight today. And as we get closer to the more spectrum auctions, I'm sure we'll touch base again on some of these topics.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.